I really like that question Brother Hall posed to us a couple of sermons ago. It was kind of a riddle type question. What is something everyone has but no one can afford? And the answer was ignorance. I really liked that. So I've got a similar question for us to consider this evening. What is something that's discussed all throughout the scriptures but is never mentioned by name? Perspective. Perspective. No, you won't find the word perspective in the Bible. Yet it's hard to go a chapter without seeing some type of reference to someone's perspective or maybe some insight into our perspective and what it should be as Christians. And we'll define perspective this evening as our attitude, our outlook, or our point of view. Our perspective as Christians is so central to who we are and to how we live, how we act, and how we react to things that might happen to us in this life. I'm reminded of Job and the illustration he gives us and the application, the vast applications we can make from his story. Over in Job chapter 42, we see all that happened to him, yet he remained faithful. In Job chapter 42, beginning with verse 1, then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore have I uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful for me which I knew not. Here I beseech thee, and I will speak. I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees thee. Wherefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. I believe Job kept his perspective. I believe his perspective helped him endure and react the way he should have throughout all that happened to him, and that's very encouraging for us. It's all about our perspective. The things that may happen to us in this life, they don't determine how we react to them. It's on us. I believe it's all about our perspective, and it's so important for us as Christians. So for us as Christians, what is our perspective, and what should it be? And I hope some things that we remind ourselves of this evening will be beneficial to us. I've got two main points this evening that I think really, in my mind, encapsulate the Christian perspective as a whole. The first being that we know we are helpless, and the second being that we live like we're homeless. And I hope I can fully explain what I mean by those two things by the end of our time. So as Christians, we know we are helpless. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the word helpless? I think of babies. I think of little children. The thing about babies and children is they cannot provide for themselves. They must rely on someone else to sustain them, to provide for them, to save them. And there's, I think, where we see the similarity with us, not in a physical sense, but in a spiritual sense. To serve God, we must first realize that we do not have the power to help ourselves, to save ourselves spiritually. And this takes a lot of humility. We see over in Matthew chapter 18, Jesus used a similar analogy, actually using a child. Matthew chapter 18, beginning with verse 2, and Jesus called a little child unto him and set him in the midst of them, and said, Verily I say unto you, except you be converted and become as little children, you shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And there's so many applications we can make from children. Here, we see Jesus specifically identifying their humility. And for our study tonight, I think we could also apply the fact that they rely on someone else to provide for them. But we see this idea of humility all throughout the scriptures. James 4 and verse 10, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. Over in 1 Peter 5, verses 6 through 7. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. And this idea of humility, we see it in Matthew 5 and verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, being poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. In my study, I found an interesting translation. It's called the God's Word translation. And I don't think any of us would subscribe to that translation or promote it or deem it as reliable. That's not what I'm doing. But I thought it interesting the way it interpreted Matthew 5 and verse 3. It said, blessed are those who recognize that they are spiritually helpless. And once we admit to ourselves that we are spiritually helpless, we're forced to rely on someone else to provide. We're forced to trust someone else. And we know that can only be God. But I think it's important to make the point that it matters who you rely on. It matters who you put your trust in. Some people put their trust in themselves. They may trust their own wisdom. We see over in James chapter 3, James 3, beginning with verse 13, we see the scriptures contrast the earthly wisdom that we have here with the wisdom from above. James 3:13, who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of a good conversation his works with meekness of wisdom. But if you had bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not, and lie not against the truth. This wisdom descends from above. This wisdom descends not from above, but is earthly, sensual, devilish. For where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy, good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. It does us no good to put our trust in our own wisdom. Our wisdom is earthly. Some people may put them trust themselves by what they've done, their own works. It reminds me of Luke chapter 18, the parable of the Pharisee and the Publican. Luke chapter 18, beginning with verse 9. And he spoke a parable unto certain which trusted in themselves, that they were righteous and despised others. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. I thought that interesting that it says he prayed thus with himself. God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in the week, I give tithes of all that I possess. And the publican, standing far off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone that exalts himself will be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. Luke 17 and verse 10, it says, when we've done all that we've been commanded to do, we're just unprofitable servants. It does us no good to put our trust in ourselves. Some people put their trust in other people, other men, the teachings of men. Over in 2 Timothy chapter 4, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust they shall heap to themselves teachers having itching ears, and they shall turn away their ears from the truth and shall be turned unto fables. I feel like we're seeing a lot of that nowadays. Matthew 15 and verse 14 refers to the blind leading the blind, and they shall both fall into the ditch. I think for our study this evening, we could call that the helpless leading the helpless. And that's the thing, when we realize that we are spiritually helpless, that we cannot save ourselves, then we know everybody else is as well. So it does us no good to put our trust, to rely on someone else, because they're just as helpless as we are. It does us no good to put our trust with anyone but God. We understand that we are not in control. I think it may be hard for some nowadays to relinquish that control. We have so much technology. We have access to information, the ability to research. And I feel like it's happened to me some recently. I do a little bit of research and suddenly I feel qualified in something that I'm really not qualified for. And I dive in head first and I figure out I'm not qualified. You can make online purchases. You can do a lot of different things and you really feel empowered. You really feel in control. But we're not in control, and it may be hard to have the humility to relinquish that control for us at times. Over in James chapter 4, I believe it speaks of this. In verse 13, go to now ye that say tomorrow, or rather today or tomorrow we will go into such a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get much gain. Contrast that with verse 15, for that ye ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. We're not in control. God is in ultimate control, and He is the one and only one we can rely on. In Hebrews chapter 1, I think we see this control. It's just such a powerful passage for me. Hebrews chapter 1. God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in time past to the fathers by the prophets, but hath in these last days spoken to us by His Son, whom He has appointed heir of all things, by whom also He made the worlds. God is in control. I believe He's in complete control. He's the only one we can rely on. And the amazing thing is that He's already provided for us. He knew we were helpless, but He provided the sacrifice. Romans 5 and verse 8, but God commends His love toward us, and while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. John 3 and verse 16, for God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. Verse 17, for God sent not His Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through Him might be saved. I feel like we've talked a lot recently about God's plan, His plan of redemption, to save the world, that His Son would be the sacrifice for sin. It's been His plan from the beginning. It was prophesied by the angel Gabriel in Matthew chapter 1, verse 21. And he said, and she shall bring forth a son, and ye shall call his name Jesus, for he shall save the people from their sins. Not only did God provide the sacrifice for us, but He still provides for us today. 1 Corinthians 10:13, we see a reference to Him providing a way of escape for us, helping us endure temptation. Along with that, we know that He provides strength for us. He'll provide comfort. He can provide peace. And we know He provides forgiveness. So I believe the Christian perspective, the Christian outlook, our point of view, I think it begins with this understanding that we are spiritually helpless, that we must rely on God who provides all that we need. I think when we know this, it promotes us to become obedient to the gospel, to become a child of God. This is the beginning of our perspective. We are helpless, but God is our helper. And once we become a Christian, I think we begin living a life much different from those of the world. Our second point tonight, we start living like we're homeless. You might say, what do you mean by that? Because we all have houses. I don't think there's anyone here that doesn't have a place to live. And we've been so blessed, I think, in that respect, especially compared to many of those in the world round about us. What I mean by that is, where are your priorities? Where do you put your emphasis? What is important to you? Luke chapter 12, we see a really powerful parable for us. Luke chapter 12 and verse 16. And he spake a parable unto them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, there it is again, putting your trust in yourself. He thought within himself, saying, what shall I do? Because I have no room where to bestow my fruits. And he said, this will I do. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then who shall those things be which you have provided, which he had provided? So is he that layeth up treasure for himself, and is not rich towards God. See where his emphasis was. Most people I work with are a little bit older than me. I've got some friends. We might take a little stroll, 15-minute break, or go grab some lunch, or what have you. I've got some friends, it seems like all they can talk about is their 401k, their investments and their finances and how things are going. Of course, if it's going bad, I hear about it, and it's the end of the world. And in my mind, I'm just like, how long do you plan on being here? How long do you plan on staying here? From my perspective, it seems a little excessive. I've been talking with someone else recently, and they posed the question to me, when is enough enough? You can be saving for retirement. You want to be able to provide for yourself and your family. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, as we talked recently, but when is enough enough? I think at some point you got to call it. You have to say, you know what? I have enough. I think God's blessed me with enough. This is enough. Yes, we have homes, we have possessions, we have obligations here on earth, but we are only here and waiting. In reality, our wait is not very long, at the longest. James chapter 4, verse 14. Our brother Todd consistently prays how our life is but a vapor. James chapter 4 and verse 14. Whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. I saw one translation, it says, your life is like the morning fog. It comes and it goes. It's here and it's gone. It's not here for very long. We're just pilgrims. We're just sojourners. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 13, these all died in faith, not having received the promise, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. John chapter 17 and verse 16 says, we are not of this world. 1 Peter 2 and verse 11 says, dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. We know Jesus himself had nowhere to lay his head. Luke 9 and verse 58, and Jesus said unto them, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. We know this earth is just temporary. It's passing away. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 18. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Not only is the world passing away, not only is the world temporary, but the things in it are as well. Matthew chapter 6, laying up for treasures on earth. Why would you do that? Because that's where moth and rust doth decay, thieves break in and steal. Laying up treasures on earth does us no good. We know that the earth one day will be burned up. 2 Peter 3 and verse 10. It says, "But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat, and the earth also, and the works that are therein shall be burned up." I was talking with someone recently about this and the beliefs they hold. This is really directly opposed to what some may teach about the earth and us living on the earth, maybe Jesus returning to rule on the earth or setting up some type of government. And the earth will not be here. The earth will be burned up. We are homeless here on earth because we're waiting. We're searching. We have hope for a promised home. A home promised to those that are faithful. And it is much better than our current home. Back over to Hebrews chapter 11. Beginning with verse 13 again, we'll read a little bit further this time. "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they say that such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city." Wow. This is the same country and city that we long for. It's a beautiful thought. Are we persuaded of that? Do we embrace that? Like verse 13 says, are we persuaded? Are we looking for a better country? You know, our home is prepared by Jesus. John chapter 14. John chapter 14. Verse 1, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. But I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also." You ever thought about that? That the home we're looking for has been prepared by Jesus. That was such a great song. We just sang it. Mansions. We're looking for a better home. I don't think there's any better parallel for us as Christians than the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness. It is so powerful. When you think about the children of Israel, they wandered in the wilderness, waiting for the promised land, looking for the promised land. And here we are. We're wandering in a wilderness of sin. And we're looking for our promised land. They were in hopes of a land flowing with milk and honey. But yet we have hopes of a city with foundations of gemstones, streets of gold, a place with no death, no pain, and no sin, a place where God lives. Do we consider ourselves homeless? I believe Paul did. 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy chapter 4. I've always loved this reading. 2 Timothy 4, beginning with verse 6. "For now I am ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day. And not to me only, but unto all those who love his appearing." Paul knew he was homeless, and he lived like that. It's been a short lesson. The Christian perspective. Can we see it now? Our outlook, our point of view, our perspective can do a lot for us. It can keep us on that narrow path we see in Matthew chapter 7. Narrow, the straight gate. Few there be that go in. The Christian perspective revolves around God, around serving Him, relying on Him alone, and preparing to meet Him in judgment. 2 Corinthians 5:10, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ and receive the things done in the body, whether good or bad. This is our perspective. And there's so much more that could have been said, many better points than I've made tonight, but I hope it's been helpful to remind ourselves of these things, and the lesson is yours. There may be some here that aren't Christians. You're not a child of God. Do you realize that you're helpless? That you're spiritually helpless. But God can help you. That's the amazing thing about it. You can become obedient tonight, become a child of God, and you can begin living like you're homeless. Won't you do so tonight? There may be some that might need to come forward for another reason. If anyone needs to come forward at this time, we ask that you do so as we sing.